and I'd like to welcome you all here today for our presentation of Out of the Port, New Perspectives on Queensland's History and Heritage. And this is a monthly series that's presented in partnership with the State Library of Queensland. As is our practice, we always begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. Colonial Australians are generally known to have been staunchly loyal in support of British goods, fashions and furnishings for their interiors. However, as the Australian colonies approached federation, local manufacturers, including furnishing businesses, argued that new nationalist loyalties should drive consumers to buy local. Today we are pleased to be able to present Tracey Avery, who will use a number of case studies to focus on the complex issues of politics, climate, labour and economics that impacted on the furnishing choices of Queenslanders. A number of you probably already know Tracey, but she's the Director of Strategy and Policy at Heritage Victoria, the Victorian state government heritage agency. However, she's a born and bred Queenslander, so she could play rugby league, state of origin. She was also the co-project and curatorial manager on the James Cook Museum in Cooktown, and she's worked for the National Trust of Victoria as their cultural heritage manager. She's currently almost finished her PhD in architecture at the University of Melbourne, and the substance of today's talk is all part of the PhD. She's just doing the last little edits, she says. And she's written widely on design history, most recently a chapter in the Design History Reader. There'll be opportunity for questions at the end of the talk, and it's also being recorded for the State Library's website. So let's welcome Tracey.
Thank you, Fiona, and I'd like to thank the Cultural Heritage Branch in Queensland and the State Library for having me today. I'll begin. At least until 1914, the fashion for furnishings in Australia is said to have broadly followed Britain. Terence Lane and Jessie Searle, writing in their book Australians at Home, concluded that, with minor modifications, we reproduced the ways of life and modes of interior decoration which then prevailed at home. And cultural historian Linda Young has said that copying domestic architecture and furnishing schemes in Britain and its colonies, including in Australia, is evidence of the cultural practice of gentility amongst the middle classes of Greater Britain at that time. So that's all of the countries of the Commonwealth were considered to be part of Greater Britain. So when I first came to consider this subject of Australian and Queensland interiors for my PhD, I kept coming back to the mismatch between conditions in Britain and colonial Australia. The differences between Australia and Britain in physical, social and economic conditions suggested to me that the recreation of a British interior in Australia presumably required certain adaptations, practical and ideological, on the part of the Australian homemaker. So, for example, images of the drawing room at Glengullen Homestead near Warwick, which were taken in the 1890s, show all the expected elements of furniture and upholstery for a British or an Australian interior of the period. And bills for this house, which are held at the State Library, showed that some items were purchased locally, but it struck me how little we understood how Australian interiors were assembled to create the appearance of a British interior. So overall, it's clear and still clear that Australians showed a desire to reproduce British interiors, but I wanted to understand what was kept, given up or changed in the process of migrating the practice of interior furnishings to Australia. The central finding of my research is that migration of ideas and goods associated with furnishing preserved the appearance of civility and gentility, but the appearance of Australian furnished interiors in late 19th century actually concealed the adaptations that Australians made to their new environment. That is, they looked much the same in photographs, but by the 1890s, the mixing of Australian and imported furniture foreshadowed an emerging Australian identity prior to federation. And the mix reflected the hybrid nature of colonial Australian identity. And I observed this in a range of architectural projects, parliamentary debates, and in auction notices for some of the upper middle class of Brisbane through the Brisbane Courier. This is the same room taken from a different angle. And a number of new meanings ascribed to furniture in Australia were not about decorative styles or the application of natural motifs of flora and fauna that we often read about. Some more potent meanings were attached to timbers and their functional qualities, their performance, and the techniques and labour employed in their construction. So within the time period under study, 1880 to 1901, great changes occurred in the economic fortunes of both Britain and Australia, and these contributed to some dramatic changes in meanings. And as a decorative and functional object, furniture was an ideal vessel to carry many layers of meaning. And in the journey to Australia, could be seen as a metaphor for the migratory experiences of its citizens. And particularly in economic terms, in this period, competing business interests collided around race when Australian furniture manufacturers found themselves torn between traditional patterns of exchange, so where Australia is seen as the supplier of raw materials, and Australia is the supplier of raw materials and the consumer of British manufactured goods, whereas Britain is the maker of those goods. And Australians' own attempt to develop a local industry in a time of economic decline, and they had increasing competition with local Chinese furniture makers. And similar issues arose in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, and all were reported in British furniture trade journals. Britain too felt under economic threat from Australian colonies. From Britain's perspective, Australia was becoming too successful at the practice of furnishing, having illustrated great skill in the making of higher classes of furniture and starting to be able to meet the needs of its own urban middle classes. So Britain thought it had dropped the ball in the 1880s by not recognising that Australians had a great social mobility and that they were demanding better class goods. And the British manufacturers were alarmed in the 1880s when Australian orders weren't propping up their businesses, because Australian orders made up the vast majority of orders for British furniture makers at that time. So the Australian interiors, in fact, benefited from Britain's poor economy, as many architects and artisans immigrated to the colonies at this time, and they brought with them cultural and design knowledge acquired from such training schools as South Kensington and the Architectural Association in London. So my thesis considered how aspects of British and emerging Australian identity were projected onto the design, making and selling and consumption of furniture. The background of the thesis set up the relationship between Britain and Australia. The former conceived, promoted and sold a model for achieving a civilised home anywhere in the world through the purchase of appropriate furnishings. And the latter aimed to blend their willingness to conform to the model with the sometimes discordant realities of their new environment. And in the main body of the thesis, I looked at three critical perspectives from the point of view of architects and designers, manufacturers and sellers, and householders, consumers. And in this sense, the three groupings were logical and artificial, as no group acted entirely independently. And to continue to study a dialogue around urban residences and how they were furnished, I tracked a group of architects, furniture makers and homemakers, particularly focusing on Queensland. And I did this through Australian books, journal articles, newspapers, parliamentary debates, some letters and the auction notices. And to provide a greater Australian context, because there hadn't really been a very clear Australian context for furnishing, I looked at British architectural, furniture and business journals, retail catalogues and advice manuals for both British and Australian audiences. So what do we visualise when we think of late Victorian interiors? In fact, we often see them as cluttered or eclectic. But the irony is that this rigid, ordered and structured view we have of life in the Victorian period is at odds with a seemingly loose and chaotic view of the styles of the interiors. And this could be seen as somewhat cluttered. It's hard to say, but some are more cluttered than this. But I've argued that there's a very clear order in the design and production and consumption of the furnishings. And by having an ordered system, Australians were able to understand it and then adapt it to their own circumstances. I've put in here a quote from Grossmith's Diary of a Nobody, published in 1892, and he concisely satirises late 19th century concerns with one's home and furnishings. And the choice of words suggests that references to house size, room use, a servant, and brand names of furnishing items were the markers that located the social position of this generic family. And in their case, they were classed as lower middle class. And in looking at these markers in details, I argued that house size, room planning, and furnishings were understood as a complete entity and not as separate, and that to look at one without the other really limits our understanding of the framework in which householders at the time made their choices. Here I've shown two images from a London firm, Utzman & Co., from about 1895. And comparison of packages in surviving catalogues for a range of firms showed that there was a simple connection between cost and house size. For example, more expensive packages are proposed for larger houses. But at a more detailed level, some proposals allowed for different costings for a house with the same number of rooms. The variations on offer were different choices of materials, mostly different timbers, or different upholsteries, and these themselves were arranged within a cost hierarchy. Additional objects, beyond the components of basic suite, such as the ones I've shown on the screen, were included in the more expensive estimates. And the importance of this is that a very wide band of people who class themselves as middle class could be seen as genteel and correct in their furnishing, but those with more money could subtly signify their higher status through choosing more expensive materials. So note that the slide, that both the drawing and dining room suites that I've shown have the same basic form. And when I photocopy them, they sit directly on top of each other. And you see that throughout the catalogues, that you have the same basic construction and you're tweaking styles and changing timbers and doing a range of things. So many things were exactly the same at the time. So it's infinitely adaptable. And based on this model, it's tempting to assume that you would transfer the meaning and status of these items directly from Britain to Australia without it changing along the way. But now I'll consider this period where in the 1880s, the Australasian colonies grew rapidly in population, wealth and confidence of their future independence. And in the same decade, which is the 1880s, a number of British reports on the state of their export market highlight this important change in the relationship that I'd mentioned. So in 1889, it was reported that British manufacturers should reimagine the furnishing requirements of the Australian homemaker as being different from their expectations of colonial domestic life. The British manufacturer was failing to keep up with international competitors, such as Germany and the United States, by not seeking out this knowledge of the colonial market. Basically, they just assumed that they knew what we were like and we would take anything. So consequently, they took their time to do that, and in doing so, they really lost their competitive edge. And the report suggested that the colonists did desire to remain loyal to British-made furniture, but that was threatened by a number of circumstances. The physical and social mobility of the population. People moved very frequently between cities and they sold up their goods as they moved and then just bought new again or bought second-hand again. The cost of shifting goods, which was the reason why they sold up, because it was a lot of money to move between Sydney and Melbourne, as it still is probably, and transport all your belongings. And there were issues around labour and clearly around climatic conditions in Australia being very different. So firstly, the various colonies, particularly Queensland, promoted primary industry of native timber production. And Australians were providing a raw material that could visibly conform to British fashions, but they were making it for local timber. And more discreetly, Australians made some invisible adaptations to comfort, such as John Hicks, who was reported in 1900 for inventing an upholstered chair formed without hot horsehair stuffing. So he'd basically taken the middle out of it, and this was a great revelation. So you would have the great appearance in your drawing room, but it wouldn't be hot to sit on, and so it was reported. And that's an ad for Hicks at that period. He's quite a well-known furniture company in Brisbane. So while reports from annual Brisbane exhibitions do show that timbers such as bunya pine and bean tree were appreciated for their beauty and local distinctiveness, native timbers were occasionally painted over in the black and gold of the aesthetic movement fashions to conform to international fashions. Excuse me. I've also taken this from the State Library collection just to show the sort of exhibition of their work. And secondly, furniture imported from Britain was subject to extreme changes of temperature on the journey and not always well packed. Consequently, by the late 1880s, British-made furniture had actually gained a poor reputation in the colonies. Many firms, including the Brisbane firm Foster & Kelk, imported furniture in the white, that is, in pieces, and they assembled them in their local workshops, very much on the IKEA principle. Another firm, Shaw & Co., claimed that in 1888 they often had to restuff chairs when they arrived because they'd been so poorly made in London. The London firm Saul Moss & Co. admitted in 1894 that Britain had in fact sent mostly common or lower class furniture to Australia for years, and it was found that the veneers buckled travelling to and through humid climates. British veneer furniture was also being criticised for the employment of sweated labour. The Scottish arts and crafts architect Robert Lorimer, writing to his friend the Brisbane architect Robin Dodds in 1899, offered to source some furniture for him in London and added, "I suppose nothing with veneer does in your climate." And on a personal note, I remember a few years ago when I came back to Brisbane after living in the UK, talking to some furniture dealers who said, "Oh, veneer, terrible stuff," but they couldn't really say why. And I now wonder whether their understanding that veneer was bad has carried over from that period, even if they don't remember why they don't like it. So as local firms tried to distinguish themselves from British imports, excuse me, they emphasised that they were employing local labour and they had high quality workmanship and they used native timbers. So they championed the patriotic duty of local citizens to support their own fledgling industry. Shaw & Co. proclaimed that those who are nationalist enough to desire Queensland-made suites can be well accommodated here. And for Britain, Australia's threat to their codependent relationship was really present from the outset of the establishment of settler colonies, because in passing on the tools and the knowledge to create British societies around the world, they could threaten Britain's own exclusive role as the provider. So in the analogy of, say, a family, the child may learn the lessons of the parent and leave home to become independent. And this is an image known as Macaulay's New Zealander, who's sitting on the ruins of London sketching St Paul's, and it was by Gustave Doré in 1872. And so there was this image was actually mentioned around the Melbourne firm Rock & Co., who'd been very successful at the Melbourne exhibition in making furniture, and it so alarmed the British furniture press that they're like, "Oh no, you know, we're being taken over, you're better than us." That is a real worry. And so the development of an Australian character that could be applied to material standards of living, which is really about the furnishing of the house and what its importance is to civilization, embraced a new, and I have to say white, European framework. And really it's more European as many in the furnishing industry had come from other European countries and not just from Britain. So looking now at some of the conversations that were taking place in Brisbane between architects, furniture makers and consumers, I wanted to show how they responded to the local circumstances. So firstly, I'll look at Brisbane-based architect G.H.M. Addison, who is a central figure in Brisbane's architectural and furnishing developments. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of Fiona Gardner on Addison and also Don Watson and Judith Mackay for their work, which has been really invaluable for continuing to research Queensland architects. These illustrations were published in the Building and Engineering Journal of Australia and New Zealand in late 1891 with the following text. We are pleased to be able to illustrate some of the fittings and furniture of the residence of W. Stevens of South Brisbane, the execution of which was entrusted to the well-known firm of George Bartholomew and Co., London and Sydney, from designs by their draftsman, Mr. James Peddle, under whose supervision the whole of the work was fitted in Brisbane. And this is Kumbakweipa at South Brisbane, which you may know of. Then a few weeks later, these images appeared with Addison reasserting his own role in the lead of the design of the interiors as well as the architecture. A few weeks ago, we gave illustrations of furniture designed by Bartholomew and Co. under the direction of the architects Oakden, Addison and Kemp, who made such alterations as were necessary to bring it into harmony with the general design, this making the whole beautifully harmonious. It's the exterior. Researching each of the key players in this project revealed that their training and body of work showed that Addison had followed the British practice of working with local furnishing firms. Addison had trained at the South Kensington schools in the early 1880s. And he also designed both the furniture and purchased fine old furniture, which we assume to be real antique furniture, in Sydney for Dunsinane at Hendra. His knowledge of antiques was shared by other architects training in Britain at the time, including Robin Dodds and Melbourne architect Robert Haddon. I'll show these as they are, on the left, Robert Haddon's drawings of some furniture. It's Italian Renaissance furniture at the V&A, which is still on show in some of the galleries, and Herbert Baker's scrapbook, showing the same table at the top. And Baker was a contemporary of Addison, and he later worked in South Africa. So there were a whole group of architects having trained in London who were spreading around the colonies, who had a very wide repertoire, gained from quite a strong design training which included looking at furniture. And it seems that the architects' knowledge of these styles and their technical ability to reproduce them was the critical cultural contribution to the colonies, not so much whether they preferred one style over another. They worked with emerging designers and makers and were stimulating design more generally in their cities, including in Brisbane. This is from the firm Bartholomew and Co. And it was a reproduction of an exhibition of 1882. Bartholomew and Co. was probably well known to Addison prior to coming to Australia. And it was an East End of London firm catering to the middle classes. And it had been imported into Brisbane, in fact, from 1879, as it appears in an advertisement for the furnishing of Samuel Davis and Co. And it was also mentioned in an auction notice for the contents of Addison's own home. So he had some of their furniture in his own collection. And the work of the firm, interestingly, had been noted in the trade journals for its Englishness. So there's an example of an architect working in a local framework, but still seeking a certain Englishness for his own furniture. This is the work of James Peddle and his hall stand of 1894, by which time, in fact, he was living in Sydney. James Peddle studied for a year at South Kensington and was himself the son of a cabinet maker and chair maker. In 1889, he immigrated to Australia to work for Bartholomew and Co. in Sydney. Bartholomew and Co. had an office in Sydney until 1896, the same year which Peddle began to practice architecture. And this is the Peddle who formed the background to the current Peddle-Thorpe-Walker practice. So partly owing to the anonymity of new immigrants, the higher wages they were paid in Australia and greater home ownership, social mobility was very rapid. And although work was becoming scarce, that British immigration reports still said you should go to Australia to gain an independent position. And Peddle really followed the premonition that the British arts and crafts movement had, that the artist would become an architect. And his application, this is Peddle's application for the Fellowship of the Royal Institute of British Architects, recorded that he'd practiced architecture in Sydney from 1896, and prior to that he'd been a draftsman. Addison's dining room addition to the home of Thomas Bunton in 1892 included furnishings from Foster and Kelk, so he was continuing to work with them. And they themselves were models of social mobility, as it's clear that they commenced business as ironmongers in the 1870s. But by 1896, they were one of the firms providing suites for rooms at Government House. So many in the local furniture industry, including Kelk, became members of the Queensland National Association, the Colonies Exhibition Society, and they used this body to promote local products. Nevertheless, the industry in Brisbane did remain relatively small. In another letter from Lorimer to Robin Dodds, he said, "I can get them made," meaning made in Britain, "though at the same time it's an awful pity if you can't be coaching up some chap out there to make decent stuff, and that it seems rot to send such simple objects so many thousand miles, but you must be the judge of that." Turning to the perspective of Foster and Kelk as local house furnishers, I'll look at how they perceive their own competition with Chinese furniture makers. In 1888, they reported that they would not be selling shoddy or Chinese articles and called for the public's notice to their honestly made bedroom suites in bunya pine, pine and cedar. And the following year, they were emphasising their ability to produce furniture of English materials and appearance, but via their in-house European labour. Foster and Kelk have on view at their showrooms in Brisbane a very handsome oak hall stand, which has been built at their workshop from imported material. The article is in every respect equal to English manufacture, and the firm find that they can import the material and make it up much cheaper than they can import the furniture ready fitted. And the householders of Brisbane were obviously responsive to these local products, as it's clear in the auction notices, particularly coming into the 1890s. I'm not sure if you can read that, but they're quite hard to get onto a PowerPoint. So it's a page from the Brisbane Courier, and it's the contents of Ulmarra, the home of Mrs. Wimble, and it noted that the majority of the furniture had been manufactured to order by Messrs. Foster and Kelk, the celebrated house furnishers. They usually appear on page 8 on the Saturday's paper. This is an ad for Foster and Kelk from a bit later, from 1893, by which time they'd really stopped talking about shoddy Chinese goods. So it's very much a time period in which the pressures were greater, and also in that other article that was in the Boomerang, which was more radical than what was written in the Courier, in the Brisbane Courier. So as you can see, they both import and they make up their own locally made goods. The point of difference between Britain and Australian-made furniture, British and Australian-made furniture, did become a question about class and performance under local climatic conditions. As a householder, no one wanted to reveal that their furniture might have been shoddily put together. But if Australian locals could be convinced that they were getting a better performing product without the old stigma of it having been colonial made, then it would make sense to attach a new meaning to the local item so that they could say that it was equal, if not superior, to the imported. The Depression of the 1890s highlights the pressure on businesses, but the same pressures had not been apparent, for example, in 1895, when in Melbourne there was a publication called the Australian Housewives Manual, and it included Chinese-made furniture as acceptable for purchasers who were on small incomes. But subsequently, Australians of European origin complained about furniture made by Chinese Australians who were being paid less, although not substantially less, and therefore they were seen to be undercutting local prices. But in fact, the European Australians did say that they couldn't tell the difference in the maker just from looking at the work. So that's why they argued to colonial governments that the work should be marked so that consumers would know the difference. Now that's the chiffonier sideboard there, and on the right-hand side, that's the inside of the right-hand door, saying A3, European labour only. And on the lower image is a piece from Fitzroy in Melbourne, where they've given the name of the firm. So it's interesting that they didn't choose to mark the piece as British or Australian or Queensland labour only. Britain had gained a bad reputation, and numerous makers that I said were from other European countries, particularly Germany and Denmark. The maker's mark for Queensland didn't say directly who made the item, and I understood, I think from Robert Riddell a number of years ago, that there may be a list that says what the A's refer to, but I haven't been able to track that down. But in Victoria, they did give the local manufacturers names. And particularly in the Queensland Parliament, they were arguing strongly that the furniture for Australians should be made by Australians. That was their basic argument. So what did the elite of Brisbane actually have in their houses in terms of Australian and British furniture? And in fact, they did have quite a lot of Chinese and Japanese furniture, but it's mostly in terms of screens, boxes, decorative items. And at this point too, would like to acknowledge the earlier work of Joanne Edwards and Nicola Stearmond, and for them allowing me to expand on their initial study. The breadth and quantity of objects listed in auction notices, along with the information available about their owners, has meant that the possible expressions of identity could be observed on a wide range of axes, that is, between houses, rooms, types of furnishings, as well as the way in which owners could be grouped or separated. And I found that a number of houses were available for lease, but they were quite prestige houses, so several people would be seen to occupy the same houses over the course of 2 decades. And similarly, there were the owners who you could see them moving around the houses of Brisbane too. Here's the auction notice for a Mr. Donkin on the left, and then the announcement for Mr. Nisbet is on the right lower corner. There were auctions at the homes of prominent citizens, and these elite auctions, in fact, elevated the formerly unacceptable practices of purchasing second-hand furniture, because it was not on in London, I found out, that to purchase second-hand furniture. But here we made an art of it, and it did happen in Sydney and Melbourne as well. But in Brisbane in particular, at a certain period, there were, lunch was provided, they told you which tram to get. It was a complete production. So there's a kind of performance associated with it as well, where you as the owner were showing your status and showing your furniture. And they would say, as they've done here, that there was more kudos if you were also your house was sited next to another famous person. So really you're not just buying the furniture, you're buying part of the cultural class of the city. Inventories from the sample in the late 1880s and 90s included suites of furniture, as described in the catalogue, 9 pieces, and the majority, it's about 75% of them, had exactly that. And the contents of Brisbane drawing rooms made references to a number of firms from both Britain and Australia. One example is Mrs. Nehemiah Bartley, who had a superior English walnut suite, and many were walnut at this period, by Jackson and Graham of London, consisting of a couch, 2 easy chairs, 6 chairs, upholstered in peacock blue and old gold plush. And the drawing rooms were almost exclusively featuring British timbers, and I'll come on to explain that. The most names given for brands of items were the pianos, and the piano was in fact always mentioned first, and they come from many countries. Mostly they're German, some British, a couple of American and 1 Canadian out of all of that, always named. So it was obviously a very expensive item, and even in Britain you could buy the piano on hire purchase and it might take 10 years to pay it off. So it's hard to believe now that that was the status item, but it was. I mean, maybe it's equivalent to the car or something like that, a large purchase. Around 1900, the names that were mentioned that in Brisbane auction notices that are relevant really include Liberty, Smee & Co, Maple & Co, Bartholomew & Co, and some from Sydney, Wallach Brothers and Farmer & Co, and from Brisbane, Foster & Kelk, Finney Isles and Shaw & Co. But there were many that didn't say exactly what. They just said that wonderful, the owner has such good taste that this is what you're buying, so we're not going to tell you who made it. It depends, yeah. So it's hard to know exactly, and it was quite a recent thing to be referring to brands, because an earlier study had shown that brand was hardly ever mentioned. So this seems to be the beginning of the kudos that comes from a brand. Some people started to have both Australian and English furniture, including Robert Wilson at Tenerife House in 1885. And others started to mention that furniture had won a prize. For example, this suite of furniture was exhibited at the National Association's exhibition 2 years ago and obtained first prize. Others referred to purchases made in Vienna, Bologna, Paris, at the Paris exhibition. So they showed that people had travelled and that really this was what you were buying into. Someone's own cultural value was being conveyed through these items. Only a few had any drawing room furniture made from native timbers, and one was John Petrie at his house at Biawar and Gregory Terrace. And the auctioneer refers to Mr. Petrie's taste and suggests that his professional interest in the local furniture trade and the long-established status of his family as early settlers allowed him to deviate from the usual choice of furniture for a drawing room. I found that reading about colonial British households in India, they too had drawing rooms that remained British in appearance, but private spaces contained local Indian objects. And the same is found here. So it's occasionally in dining rooms and in bedrooms that you see the native timber suites. So where Mrs. Bartley had a London drawing room suite, she also had dining room furniture in cedar, and the principal bedroom had a solid brass bedstead from London firm Winkfield, but a wardrobe inlaid with 7 Queensland woods. Foster and Kelk specialise in the production of bedroom suites in Bunya Pine, so you could see that you could maintain a cosmopolitan British appearance in the drawing room, but it was acceptable in the dining room and bedroom to have native timbers. So it's almost suggesting that your friends and neighbours would see that you know what's correct when they come into the drawing room, but that you're starting to express pride in having a local identity, but that's still reserved for maybe family only. Oops. Now that's just showing you Bartholomew and Co. And they were, they haven't been so well known, but they are well known in the UK. And that they specifically were one of these firms that thrived in the 1880s and 90s by designing furniture for export. So they weren't making so much for the British market, it was more for export. And they also were one of the few, a couple of these firms had employed designers, and that was very unusual at that time. Now finally I'd just like to show you these couple of photographs, and this is a bedroom at Toorak House. And although I've got an inventory for Toorak House, the bedrooms were not listed separately, so I couldn't tell whether this was whether it matched, in fact, and that is a way to use this material, but it doesn't always work. Bedrooms in the sample included light-coloured timbers, and you could read this two ways, that on the one hand, the native timbers were something special to Queensland, but on the other hand, light-coloured fancy timbers were recommended in British advice manuals for a bedroom anywhere, for a bedroom in Britain. And you can see on the left that the bedrooms in Brisbane were decorated with mosquito nets and hangings. Hall furniture in Queensland also might contain a water fountain, but a space for hanging coats or hats, and had lots of mats. Verandas had chairs indicating forms suited to the tropics, such as squatters' chairs, Singapore lounges, rattan and cane, and this is another photo from the State Library showing cane making. So in conclusion, I've argued that furniture does have visible and aesthetic characteristics, but it has these other less visible issues that reflect design, construction and making, and it's these characteristics that can be used to reject or reinforce a message about where you stood in relation to your neighbours, and allowed a place like Brisbane to establish its own sense of design identity by treating native timbers as something special and making them equally, if not more important, than having imported objects. So practically speaking, I think this work has some implications for how we understand the significance of Australian furniture of this period, and for how we interpret interiors in house museums, and that we can't just rely on photographs. So ultimately, I hope this has made a start on giving some greater insight into the position of Australian and Queensland colonial interiors within Greater Britain. Thank you. So can I take any questions? And apologies for getting dry. Yes?
An extensive, what appears to be an extensive auction trade would have had the effect of separating a lot of these furnishings from their original houses.
Yes.
Did you find that this was as a result of bankruptcy or death of the owner, or simply moving on to another property?
I think sometimes it's moving on to another property. What I started to look at was that many houses were leased, and there are books in Britain that describe the average period of a lease is 7 years, and so at the end of the lease in Britain, the owner moves on and you sell up. So I don't think people were as emotionally connected to their furniture in the way that we are now, and it was, even though it was expensive, they were spending a smaller proportion of their income on their rent or mortgage. So at the time the guide was like 12 to 15%, and now we're all spending 50%. So they could afford to let go of those things and get them back. And if they didn't know if they're going to be staying here or having to go to Adelaide for a job or go to all over Queensland, it was going to just be easier to sell up. And that's what the British furnishing reports had actually said, that people are moving on so much that they just send them to the auction house, and that's all. But interesting here, it's that they're not at the auction mart, they're on the premises. So, any? Yes,
Tracey, quite interested in the proportion of imported furniture in middle-class houses.
Yeah.
Because right from the start of Queensland public buildings, for instance, our very first Parliament House, which was a converted convict building in the 1860s, we're using local furniture manufacturers and also local timbers. And this continues with the first purpose-built Parliament House in the 1870s. Petries did the furniture for that,
Yes.
and also for the first government house. So it is surprising to me to see when we're really putting our wealth on show in public buildings, when we're showing local furniture. Whereas when people are putting their wealth on show in private buildings, you're arguing that they're mostly showing imported furniture.
yes, and I also, in the thesis, I went into the government house I've written quite a bit about the 1895-96 furnishing scheme, in which, yes, it's very clear that they say that they're going to spread the work out amongst all the local makers, so they give Hicks, Finials, Foster and Kelk, a whole range of them, and some of the individual cabinet makers do work, and they say that that's part of displaying Queensland, and that's right. So that, and I had read your work as well, and it seemed that that's part of that the government house, in that sense, is about showing Queensland as a business, as an enterprise, and showing that side of it. But some of these people, yes, some of them had some locally made things, but I think that they're a sense, it's a bit like, you could write the same thing about the last 20 to 30 years. When the wealth is going, well, we want what someone has in London or New York or wherever, and we do pride ourselves on having some imported cars or whatever, but we try and balance that with buying locally made as well. And it seems that the individual is more about trying to show their own knowledge and their own place in the international scene. So they're not so much concerned about just supporting locally made. Although some of it's hard to tell, because if Foster and Kelk were importing and then making it up, how do you class that? That's why I've said that it's not so much where it's come from, but it's that they put it together here. And the same, I hate to go back to cars, but it's very similar to the car industry. We assemble Toyotas here, we assemble other cars here, but we're happy to buy them because local people and local jobs have been supported. And I think it's something where they realised the industry was never going to grow so large too. So even though there was a lot of promotion by the state, the industry didn't really take off. So I don't know why, but I think it's just showing yourself as an international citizen may be different from the obligations of a government to show just the products of that state. So, any other questions? At some point when this is complete, it will probably be available online, and there's a lot of material in there, and I've tracked down lots of different references. So hopefully, if any of you are interested in the detail, you would be able to find that for yourself. So, thank you.
I'm sure you can grab Tracey after if you've got some other questions, but thank you very much for a fascinating and, obviously in-depth research that you've done. It's always thrilling, and especially to be at the State Library, to have these talks and to see the resources being used. It's a great connection of these series of talks. I think as you go out, you'll see a piece of paper where there's an evaluation form, and would really encourage you all to fill that in if you have time, because we'd like to keep the talks going, so we need everyone's support. I suppose the last plug is for next month, which is Ian Townsend, and he's going to be exploring Australia's deadliest storm, Cyclone Mahina. So same time next month. Hope to see you all.